So you're someone who really wants to get a handle on the big, complex ideas floating around, right?
Yeah, to understand them properly,
Yeah.
but without wading through tons of jargon.
Exactly. And that's what we're tackling today. We're diving into this term you hear constantly, woke.
Hmm.
And we've got some really fascinating, maybe even, well, provocative material looking at it from a unique angle.
That's right. We're going to explore this whole idea of woke, this
Mm.
contemporary thing, using an essay from the Brownstone Institute.
Okay.
And we're going to sort of contrast it, put it head to head with some very old wisdom, specifically Aristotle's classical virtues.
Interesting.
Yeah, we'll pull out the main arguments from this essay, look at historical echoes, maybe even some surprising links to, like, economic trends.
Absolutely. So we have this Brownstone Institute essay, and it's worth noting they definitely have a distinct perspective.
For sure.
We'll also weave in some quotes from historical figures, look at current events that might illustrate these points, maybe even some economic data for a wider picture. Our mission really is just to cut through the noise, give you the crucial insights from these sources, help you understand what's really being argued here.
Okay, so let's start by trying to unpack how the Brownstone team, Paul Frieders, G.G. Foster, Michael Baker, how they actually define woke.
Good place to start. And we should probably mention the Institute's background first.
Yeah, good point. Their stated mission is focused on analyzing the COVID lockdowns, figuring out where they came from, and promoting things like free speech, open debate.
So that's the lens they're using.
Okay.
And how do they describe woke? Is it a movement?
Well, that's just it. They describe it as elusive,
Yeah.
hard to pin down.
Yeah.
Is it a movement, a religion, just an attitude, maybe a mix of all three?
Huh, okay.
But they do identify five key attitudinal elements they see as being core to it.
All right, where are they?
So the first one they call identity theft.
Identity theft. What do they mean by that?
They use the example of gender self-identification. So if someone identifies as a woman, they are considered a woman, and disagreeing can have consequences, social or even legal.
Okay.
And the authors argue this view kind of dismisses the validity, the importance of identities that were understood differently before, maybe parallels to older debates on cultural appropriation, but applied very specifically here.
Got it. Okay, that's the first one. What's next?
The second element is illiberalness.
Illiberalness.
Yeah. As they see it, it's about rejecting open debate, the free exchange of different ideas. Their examples often point to attempts to, shut down discussions or silence views they disagree with.
Right, disrupting public spaces, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Then there's cancel culture.
Okay, familiar term. How do they frame it?
They describe it as an effort to dismantle symbols, traditions, particularly of Western culture. So taking down statues, attacking artwork, going after people's careers if they say something deemed wrong.
Understood. That's three.
Fourth is victimhood.
Yeah.
Their argument is that this culture puts a huge emphasis on feeling powerless, being a victim, especially linking that feeling to perceived injustices, historical or current, rooted in Western society. Like victimhood becomes the main way people see things.
Okay, and the fifth one?
The fifth is alarmism.
Alarmism.
Yeah, this idea they see of constantly promoting impending doom. Civilization is about to collapse because of climate change or viruses or whatever the next big threat is.
And they suggest new causes keep popping up as the supposed solutions.
Exactly. New totems, as they put it.
What's really striking, though, is their claim about tolerance and inclusivity.
Right. They argue that all the talk about tolerance, acceptance, inclusivity, it's just a mask, basically.
That's facade.
Yeah. They argue the actual actions and reactions often show the complete opposite of those values.
Okay, so that's the attitudes. Did they talk about activities?
They did. They categorized woke activities into three types. First is what they call a territorial raid.
Territorial raid. Sounds aggressive.
Well, they describe it as taking over cultural and economic spaces, places previously, controlled or occupied by other groups. They see it as a historical pattern, really.
Opportunistic groups capitalizing on change.
Sort of, yeah. During times of upheaval, they even give historical examples like their interpretation of later feminism or intersectionality
How do they interpret those?
as movements trying to redistribute privilege, essentially. And they argue the current movement is led by young white Westerners trying to take influence from older generations of white people.
That's quite a specific and, potentially controversial take.
It is very specific. The second type of activity they frame as a religious experience.
Religious. How so?
Their argument is that with its strong moral pronouncements, its intolerance for dissent, It functions like a new absolutist religion.
Like tearing down old gods.
Exactly. They even quote H.L. Mencken here. Moral certainty is always a sign of cultural inferiority.
Wow.
They see it as abandoning Enlightenment ideas like freedom of belief, freedom of speech, echoing historical shifts where old beliefs get overturned.
Okay. So territorial raid, religious experience.
Mhm.
What's the third?
The third they call parasitism.
Parasitism. That
Uh,
sounds harsh.
It is. Their argument is that this culture feeds off the successes, the structures of the West, while simultaneously attacking its foundations.
Like what foundations?
Things like the traditional family, positive views of history, even attacking science, especially, they say, during COVID.
Did they give an example of attacking science?
They mentioned the relatively quiet reporting on Novak Djokovic's anti-vaccine stance as an example of maybe selective scrutiny.
Interesting. Any other examples?
They bring up the Posey Parker incident in New Zealand. She was talking about biological womanhood.
Right, I remember hearing about that. There were protests.
Intense protests, yeah,
Yeah.
sometimes violent. And the authors argue the reaction, the media coverage, it reveals a fundamental intolerance, despite the claims of inclusivity.
And the irony they point out.
The irony they highlight is that she needed police protection, often from people exhibiting behaviors that, some feminist critiques might historically associate with male aggression.
That is complex. So how do they sum up their definition of woke?
Well, they conclude with a very, very strong statement. They call it a sterile death cult of unproductive, whining kids who find each other in a raid on the adults they host to replace.
Ooh, okay. That's blunt. Definitely a critical perspective.
Extremely critical, yes.
All right, so moving on from the definition, what about the politics and economics of it, according to them?
Well, this is a major claim they make. They argue that woke could theoretically be crushed by big money, by
Yeah.
powerful financial interests.
But it isn't.
But it isn't, they say, because it actually aligns with the interests of large corporations, international agencies, what they call the globalist class.
Globalist class. What do they mean by that exactly? Powerful international players.
Yeah, basically. Think large multinational corporations, international bodies. The authors argue these groups see woke as useful,
Useful how?
as a tool to divide society, maybe maintain control. The old enemy of my enemy is my friend idea. Plus, there's an economic angle. Aligning with certain stances could potentially mean more business, more influence.
Good, but does the essay acknowledge any pushback? Any resistance?
It does, yeah. It recognizes there's growing resistance among the general public and also within privately owned businesses.
Any examples?
They mention the backlash Anheuser-Busch faced, and Target too, over some marketing campaigns. It suggests public companies are, getting more aware of negative public opinion, potential hits to the bottom line.
Right, makes sense.
The analysis also touches briefly on broader societal issues using a pretty grim headline
Oh, what's that?
about a mother arrested for shoplifting while her car with her kids inside caught fire.
Wow. That's awful. How does that connect?
It's presented as sort of an illustration of deeper problems in the economy and the social structure.
I see. And they also mentioned shifting views on transgender issues.
Yeah, they cite a Gallup survey showing more people believing transgender athletes should compete based on birth gender and more people seeing changing gender as morally wrong. A potential shift in public mood, perhaps.
And there was something about a German sermon.
Right, just another example they use to illustrate what they see as extreme manifestations. A sermon condemned as blasphemous for saying God is queer.
Okay. So tying this back to the globalist class idea.
The Brownstone authors basically reiterate their view. This class is using woke as a disruptive force. They call it a fascist shock army.
Strong language again.
Very. To create division while aiming for, ultimately, a kind of technocratic, neo-feudal control system.
A risky strategy, surely.
They concede that, yes. It's a big gamble, relying on the erosion of the rule of law, undermining the West's strengths.
And their concluding thought on this section.
That's another forceful one. Woke's lust for destruction has emerged from the heart of a decaying Western society. Represents in 4 letters what ails the West, and the antithesis of what is needed to heal the West.
Okay. Powerful stuff. So let's pivot now. How do they connect this to classical virtues?
Right. This is where they bring in people like Edmund Burke. They quote him saying, "But what is liberty without wisdom and without virtue? It is the greatest of all possible evils."
Setting the stage.
Exactly. Setting the stage for their core argument
Mhm.
that woke, as they've defined it, is the polar opposite of those virtues valued in Greco-Roman times.
And they focus on Aristotle's main four.
Yes, the four cardinal virtues: prudence, justice, temperance, and courage.
Let's unpack those a bit. Prudence, that's like practical wisdom.
Yeah, practical wisdom. Seeing the good in a situation, choosing the right way to achieve it. They quote Aristotle on virtuous giving. It's not just giving, but how you give, who you give to, the timing, the amount.
Right, thoughtful action and justice.
For Aristotle, justice is multifaceted. It's about general moral goodness, but also specifically fairness in how we deal with each other.
Because we live in societies.
Precisely. He saw humans as social, political beings. So justice is crucial for a community to flourish. They quote him saying a statesman should aim to cultivate moral character in citizens.
Okay. Prudence, justice, temperance.
Temperance is moderation, especially with bodily pleasures, food, drink, sex. Finding a healthy balance, avoiding extremes, enjoying things, but in a controlled way.
Makes sense. And the last one, courage.
Courage or fortitude. It's about managing fear, acting with confidence despite danger, but for the right reasons, for what's noble or right.
Not just being reckless.
No, definitely not. It's managing fear, not eliminating it. Both Aristotle and Confucius apparently saw it as fundamental.
Did the essay mention other virtues?
Briefly, yes. Things Aristotle talked about like truthfulness, generosity, friendliness, even wittiness. Also Confucius's 5 virtues: dignity, magnanimity, earnestness, sincerity, kindness.
Quite a list. And then they shift to the Roman idea,
Yeah, the Roman concept of virtus.
which started as
Primarily martial courage, battlefield strength, but it evolved to include those Greek virtues: prudence, justice, temperance, fortitude.
so it became more about general character.
Yes, associated with masculine strength, valor, manliness, but also excellence and moral character overall. Interestingly, they note that gratitude and loyalty aren't really highlighted in Greek or Roman lists.
Huh. Didn't notice that. Did they connect this to Roman leaders?
They did. They give examples of emperors seen as great, like Trajan or Hadrian, presumably seen as embodying virtus,
Contrasted with.
bad emperors like Caligula or Nero, seen as lacking these virtues. They even briefly mention Elagabalus,
The controversial one.
right, whose behavior and identity have led some historians to view him as maybe an early transgender figure, highlighting how complex these historical comparisons can be.
True. So the main takeaway here is
The central point they're making is that in their analysis, wokeness, with those pillars they identified, identity theft, illiberalness, cancel culture, victimhood, alarmism, just stands in stark contrast to these classical virtues.
a complete opposition in their view.
That's the argument.
Okay. And finally, they touched on some historical parallels and economic context briefly.
Yeah, just briefly. They compare the potential U.S. decline to Rome's fall, but they add a nuance
Which is?
that Rome had bad emperors followed by capable ones. So maybe the U.S. could follow that pattern too. And they remind us Rome always had political turmoil.
Right, it wasn't exactly stable. What about the economics?
They raise flags about GDP growth figures, suggesting they might be inflated by government deficits and monetary policy.
Pointing to.
The big gap between the magnificent 7 tech stocks doing great and the rest of the market being flat. A divided economy, the economy of the 0.1% versus everyone else.
And they see evidence of this in everyday life.
Yeah, they mention things like ongoing inflation, especially online groceries, and discount stores like Dollar Tree struggling, tangible pressures on regular people.
Even mentioned Europe.
High food inflation there too, partly blamed on government policies. They quote Stephanie Pomboy calling falling retail sales F-ugly.
Okay, pretty blunt. Any mention of recession fears?
Yes, concerns from economists like Edwards, Minack, Bismagen, despite good job numbers. They point to technical things, like the gap between GDP and GDI, revisions to income data, as warning signs.
Did they touch on greedflation?
Briefly, the idea that companies used inflation as cover to boost profits, and how government stimulus kept demand high, allowing those margins.
Right. And that Forbes survey.
Just a quick mention that a survey showed executives supporting Biden's manufacturing policies.
But they suggest why.
Yeah, they imply it's likely due to the subsidies involved, and note that many Forbes readers probably disagree.
Okay. And a final historical parallel.
To the German hyperinflation in the 1920s, they quote an economist, Bresciani Tironi.
What did she observe?
He noted how that inflation benefited entrepreneurs, speculators, while real wages fell for workers, creating a new class of profiteers. They draw a parallel to today's rapid changes due to monetary inflation.
Okay, so quite a sweep of arguments there. Let's try and wrap this up. So if we boil it down, The core argument presented in this brownstone material is that woke, defined in their specific way,
With those 5 attitudes and 3 activities.
right, stands in fundamental opposition to that classical Greco-Roman understanding of virtue.
That's the essence of their contrast, yes.
Which leads to a really interesting question for anyone listening, doesn't it?
Definitely. Does this framework, this stark contrast they draw, does it resonate with your own observations? What you see happening around you?
Exactly. And how might understanding these different ways of looking at things, woke as they describe it, versus classical virtue, how might that help navigate the complexities, the arguments we see today?
It's a lens, isn't it? One way to frame the debate.
It is. And maybe a final thought to leave people with based on this analysis.
Okay.
What role do those individual classical virtues, prudence, justice, temperance, courage, what role do they play today? Do they contribute to or maybe counteract the trends identified here as woke?
That's a deep question. How do personal ethics intersect with these big societal trends? Worth reflecting on the source material for sure, and seeing if this perspective changes how you view things.
Absolutely. Something to mull over.